You know, the Ten Commandments always seem to have a very, very special place in the heart of every Christian. Christians who in the main have no time whatsoever for any of the other moral codes that exist within the Old Testament, nevertheless regard the Ten Commandments as something that is still relevant today, as something to act as a sort of guiding light, or perhaps a moral cornerstone to underpin the morality not just of Jews, of Christians, but something that is relevant to all of us today, regardless of your religion, or regardless if you don't have a religion or don't have a belief in God. The Ten Commandments are a marvellous thing to go by, a marvellous starting point. Well, I was making a video the other day that involved the Ten Commandments, and I had a kind of Damascus moment whilst doing so, when it suddenly occurred to me what a fucking useless load of old tripe the Ten Commandments actually are. If you were to try and draw some kind of graph of vauntedness against usefulness, I don't really think the Ten Commandments would come off very well. So what I want to do in this video is to have a look at the Ten Commandments and to try and show you just why they really are just a little bit pants. So maybe what we should do is to start off with the biggies, the real big three. These are the real ones that people say, well, look, these are marvellous principles by which to live your life. How can you argue with these regardless of whether you've got a religion or not? And that would be, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not bear false witness. You know, I've got to say, right, when it comes to giving moral advice, this is a little bit akin to God saying, eat food, have a drink, and don't stick your cock in the mincing machine. Because in a moral sense, what has happened is the equivalent, perhaps, of we've just been dropped off in the jungle and we have no idea what foodstuffs are edible and what's poisonous, and we don't really know how to survive, and we've appealed to God for advice, and we've said, God, what should I do? What can I eat here? And what he said to us is, well, what I would do is I'd stick for the non-toxic stuff and maybe try and find something that is a little bit nutritious. No shit, God, that's really, really useful, that advice that you've given us here. Thou shalt not kill, translated in some translations as thou shalt not murder. And that gives you some idea of what the problem is with that. The literal translation, the closest that we can come to from the Hebrew, the word that's used means unlawful killing, so it's almost tautological in its definition to begin with, in that what it's telling us is, well, don't kill in those situations where it's wrong to kill. That's really, really helpful advice there. The problem is that the moral discussions we have, and seemingly this was overlooked by God, when he created us in his image, he was obviously blinded to this. The moral problems we have isn't whether or not you should kill. It's when it's justifiable to kill. What are the circumstances where it's okay to kill, and where are the circumstances where it's not? The very fact that the Hebrew word that's used means something along the lines of unlawful killing, perhaps that gives you some indicator that the people that wrote this kind of knew that that's what it was all about, even before the commandment had been given. And the same thing is true with stealing, and the same thing is true with bearing false witness, lying. There isn't a single religion, there isn't a single culture, including barely contacted tribes that we've stumbled across around the world, where you can go around killing or stealing or lying without some form of societal condemnation. It seems that every culture around the world seems to have managed to stumble across these moral basics without the need for God. God has added absolutely nothing whatsoever to the moral conversation in these edicts, in these commandments that he's made. Absolutely useless contribution from God on what are regarded, what are vaunted as these three major pillars that should underpin our morality. Absolutely useless. But what about the rest of the Ten Commandments? Perhaps there's something we can find there that could be of use. The very first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, is of use. But it's only of use if you believe in the kind of little big God, the God that is purported to be omniscient and omnipotent, but somehow still seems to have the same foibles and the same neuroses that we have as human beings. A lot of Hindus believe in the concept of Brahman, who is also claimed to be omniscient and omnipotent. Brahman would have no time for this shit, right? He is omniscient and omnipotent. You can believe whatever the crap you like. None of it matters to him. Why? Because he's omniscient and omnipotent. It only seems to be the most petty-minded gods and the people that believe in the most petty-minded gods that could get anything out of this commandment. The next commandment, thou shalt not make any graven images. Well, the Catholic Church, fucking hell, the Catholic Church are the largest Christian denomination in the world, and they have made it their business for centuries unending to make as many graven images as they possibly can. What they determine is, well, it's okay to make such an image as long as you don't worship the actual image and that you worship what lies, the supernatural that lies behind the image. When was the last time anybody, since Baal was worshipped, right? What since then has anybody ever worshipped an actual image or an actual statue? That's just tilting at windmills, that really is. That never happens. So what use is that as an actual commandment? The next couple of commandments, don't take the Lord's name in vain and remember the Sabbath day. Even most Christians don't take these things seriously, for God's sake. And this is the thing, most Christians would happily say the same thing. If they don't take it seriously, how can that be worthy as a commandment? So what about thou shalt not commit adultery? Because that sounds sound advice, right? That is something that is open to debate, and there we're getting a little bit of guidance. And after all, we know what adultery is, don't we? Well, that's the problem. We don't know what adultery is. Bear in mind this was written by the Israelites. This is relevant to the Israelites, so we need to be minded of what the Israelites regarded as adultery. And what for Israelites was adultery was a married man having sexual intercourse with a married woman. He could fuck his own slaves until his cock dropped off, and that was okay. He could have sex with an unmarried woman. That wasn't a problem. Now, the problem was having sex with a married woman. Why? Because this is another example of property rights. A person, a woman, a married woman isn't regarded as a person, she's regarded as the property of her husband. So effectively, by having sex with a married woman, what they regarded as adultery, you were treading on the other man's territory, you were impinging on his property rights. Now, do you regard that as a moral way of looking at things? Because if you don't, this is hardly a very good example of a commandment, because it doesn't mean adultery as you and I would understand the term. Well, but what about what is usually the last commandment on the list, which is thou shalt not covet? Specifics are sometimes given: thy neighbour's wife or thy neighbour's ass, or I don't think it's in the Old Testament anywhere, but probably the dodgiest of the lot would be if you started coveting thy neighbour's wife's ass. I need to actually try to stay focused at this point. So, yeah, coveting is portrayed as this universally evil thing, this wrong thing, this thing that you mustn't do that goes against God. But surely coveting is just kind of like one example. It's one facet of being aspirational. It's looking at something that somebody else has got and saying, do you know what, I wouldn't mind a little bit of that and perhaps a little bit more besides. And isn't it that sort of that human drive to be aspirational that has got us where we are today, that has made us all more comfortable and happier and more secure, and made our communities more secure, and led to the invention of various technologies and modern medicine? Surely modern medicine is a moral good. And yet if we weren't aspirational, if we didn't have this desire to covet and to have things that we don't presently have, none of that would have been achieved. And yet it's portrayed in the Ten Commandments in an entirely negative way. I find that morally objectionable in and of itself. So that leaves just one, which you may have noticed if you're familiar with your Ten Commandments that I skimmed over and didn't mention, which is honour thy father and thy mother. And if there's one thing that I think is as of use, certainly nowhere near enough use to justify all the rest of the dross that is within the Ten Commandments, or the status that it has, it is to honour thy father and mother. So that is what I will do to end this video, and to say thank you to my mother for bringing me up as a moral and decent person, spending so much time with me when I was in my youth, and for being such a lovely and wonderful woman. And thank you to my father for shaping me into the person that I am, for giving me an interest from a very young age in science and philosophy, and in the study and interest of religion and atheism and all the subjects that are around it. Without my father, this video would never have been made. So I honour my mother and my father, and I'll leave you on that note. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Bye for now.